Okay. Well, thank you very much, James, for that introduction, and also to you and Benedict for the invitation to speak at this fascinating and important event. I was sort of slightly knocked sideways by Schweitzer's volume 2 of Philosophy and Civilization. I thought it was a remarkable achievement. And one remarkable aspect of it is the number of traditions that he covers. So he talks not only about the ancient Greeks, but he talks about later Western philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, and it's difficult to generalize about his interpretative method. So I think it might be worth focusing on one particular area. So I've chosen British moral philosophy because that's something I know a bit about. And I guess my general conclusion is that, and this sort of resonates actually with some of the themes in the earlier papers today. General conclusion is that Schweitzer is actually closer to some of the thinkers that he's criticizing than he seems to have thought. And this may be a good thing for him, rather than a bad thing. So, just a bit of background to Schweitzer's critique. He thinks that philosophy in general has failed to provide the basis for civilization because it's been focused only on academic questions. And what we want is what he calls world affirmation, life affirmation, and an ethical system that will support that activity, giving our life a meaning, based on such thought about the world and life as finds a meaning in them. Western thought's aimed at that, but it's been led to what he calls an optimistic ethical interpretation of the world, ignoring the possibility of world negation and life negation, as found, he thinks, in certain Chinese and Indian traditions, where we get the idea, for example, that life is an illusion, nothing matters, everything is vanity, and so on. And he thinks that the optimistic ethical interpretation has to be renounced if we take the world as it is. It's impossible to attribute to it a meaning in which the aims and objects of mankind and of individual men have a meaning also. So that's a quote from Schweitzer. The world affirmation and life affirmation can't come from knowledge of the world, he thinks. They have to come from the will to live, kind of volition. And as we now know, the most profound achievement of the will to live is reverence for life. And I give value to my own life through reverence for life in general. Now, in experiencing the will to live in myself, I experience God as mysterious. That is beyond scientific understanding. So there is a religious aspect to this. And for Schweitzer, world affirmation, life affirmation, and ethics are non-rational. They're not a matter of reason. Schweitzer's book, of course, appeared in 1923. And that was the year before Moritz Schlick began the weekly discussions of what came to be known as the Vienna Circle. So the first thing I want to suggest is that Schweitzer's meta-ethics may perhaps be more an expression of the spirit of his time than he realized, because they were obviously non-rationalists when it comes to ethics. And it's worth noting the influence of a broadly Humean idea of ethics on the circle, especially perhaps on A.J. Ayer, Alfred Ayer, who expressed his own version of Viennese Humeanism in his famous book, Language, Truth and Logic, which was first published in 1936. So that brings us to Hume and the quotation there on the handout. So Hume says, take any action allowed to be vicious, willful murder, for instance. Examine it in all its lights and see if you can find that matter of fact or real existence which you call vice. In whichever way you take it, you find only certain passions, motives, volitions, and thoughts. There's no other matter of fact in the case. The vice entirely escapes you as long as you consider the object. You never can find it till you turn your reflection into your own breast and find a sentiment of disapprobation which arises in you towards this action. Here is a matter of fact, but 'tis the object of feeling, not of reason. It lies in yourself, not in the object, so that when you pronounce any action or character to be vicious, you mean nothing but from the constitution of your nature, you have a feeling or sentiment of blame from the contemplation of it. Now, I'm not saying that Schweitzer would have agreed with all of that, but I suspect that he would have accepted the metaphysics that lies behind it, which is a non-realist ethical metaphysics. The properties of good and bad are not out there in the world. The world does not contain values in that way. They have to come somehow from us. And you might say, well, there's another big difference, which is Schweitzer is a theist, whereas Hume is not. But actually, I think there's no reason why Hume would object to our projecting God onto the world if it turned out to be a valuable thing to do. His main problem with God is that he thinks believing in God is damaging to us rather than beneficial. Okay, so that's Schweitzer's meta-ethics. Thank you. Okay, so now let's get on to rationalist optimism, to use Schweitzer's terminology. So he says the rationalist worldview is optimistic and ethical. Its optimism consists in that it assumes as ruling in the world a general purpose directed to the achievement of perfection, and that from this purposiveness, the efforts of individual men of mankind in general to secure material and spiritual progress derive meaning and importance, and in addition, a guarantee of success. So one general point I wanted to make about Schweitzer, and this arises at various points, and I'll discuss another of them later, is that he tends to blur the distinction between is and ought to be. So he's not always totally clear about whether he's talking about what people are like or what they ought to be doing. And in the light of that, it's worth noting that rationalists, one could be a rationalist in his sense, but pessimistic about the future. So you don't have to be optimistic. And we've been talking about meta-ethics. We want to separate meta-ethics, which is the philosophical account of what's going on in ethics, from ethics. And Hume is very clear about that. So in the introduction to his treatise, his great work, The Treatise, which he wrote, I think, at the age of 26, isn't that right? Published at the age of 26. He says, I'm not going to give you any ethics in this book. I am an anatomist. I'm just going to tell you about ethics. So I'm just going to give you meta-ethics. Now, of course, he doesn't quite keep to that. So very often he is slipping into giving his own ethical views. But the distinction is certainly one he's pretty clear about. And this, I think, raises the question about what's going on with Schweitzer. So if we separate off his meta-ethics, which is subjectivist, essentially, like Hume's, his ought, when he's actually in morality telling us what we should do, which would be to respect or reverence life, his view seems rationalistic. He says we should aim for spiritual progress and meaning. That's what we should do. He's then got a story about what it means to say that, but that's a separate story. It seems to fit his account of what it is to be a rationalist. So one wonders whether Schweitzer might not be actually a closet rationalist. And he would never have considered that he could have been, because I think he would have been committed to this view of the world, which most people seem to have around that time, that there are no values in it. They have to come from us. But at other times, he'll say something which sounds much more like, for example, the kind of thing that the great British rationalist Clarke would have said. So he says here in the second volume, the knowledge derived from my will to live is direct and takes me back to the mysterious movements of life as it is in itself. The highest knowledge then is to know to the will to live. So, yeah, when Clarke said, I know that there are certain things I should do, he would have said that's an intuition, that's the epistemological account he would have given, that he was intuiting a necessary truth, a priori. Now, Schweitzer is on the side of Hume, so he's going to say, look, there aren't any such necessary a priori truths to intuit. But it seems to me conceivable that when he was actually having the experience of thinking, I know that we should reverence life, he was in the same state of mind as Clarke was in when he claimed to know this. So it could be that Schweitzer is actually having a possible intuition of a self-evident truth of the kind we find in Clarke and Sidgwick. But he's taking that to be the expression of his will to live, because he thinks it's got to come from somewhere, so it must be coming from his will to live. He's got a different metaphysics, but it could be that the experience of grasping this proposition, or apparently grasping this proposition, very similar to the rationalist experience. And it's worth noting his description of the philosophy of the Cambridge Platonists as lifeless and semi-scholastic. And I wonder whether the difference there is actually one of content rather than epistemological substance. So what he doesn't like about the Cambridge Platonists is that their reverence for lifeless, that makes them lifeless. But they're doing the same thing as him, perhaps. That could be wrong. I mean, perhaps he does actually hold that his own knowledge claims are as lacking in foundation as any other. Because at other times, if you look at page 14 of the English translation of the volume, he is really rather sceptical. Okay. So Schweitzer on 17th to 18th century ethics. So he's got a whole chapter on that. Very interesting chapter. And it focuses largely on egoism and altruism, the psychology and the philosophy of that. And he says there are three ways in which the relations between the egoistic and the altruistic can be made clear. Either one assumes that the egoistic in the thought of the individual is automatically converted into the altruistic by consistent meditation, or one supposes the altruistic to have its meaning in the thought of society, and thence to pass over into the convictions of the individual. Or one retires to the position that egoism and altruism are both among the original endowments of human nature. Now, once again, we've got the descriptive, the is, which is about the moral psychology of human beings. What are they like? Are they egoistic or are they altruistic? Or a bit of both. And the normative, philosophical ethics, what should we be doing? Is it rational to be egoistic or is it rational to be altruistic? He tends to mix those questions together, and it's really worth keeping them apart, I think. And he says that in Hobbes, Locke and Bentham, altruism arises in the individual from society. So any altruism in there is coming from society. Well, it depends on what you mean by altruism. Hobbes and Locke are psychological egoists. So any assistance to others is going to be motivated ultimately by your own self-interest, according to them. Bentham holds a predominant form of psychological egoism. So he thinks most of the time people are self-interested, but sometimes they're not, but we don't need to bother about that too much because it's really rare. So occasionally, perhaps some sacrifice to others is possible. But ethically, or normatively, these people are really quite different. I mean, Hobbes is a rational egoist. Bentham is a utilitarian, completely the other end of the spectrum. And I think Locke is certainly not a rational egoist. If anything, he's probably more like a kind of deontologist. Though there are some utilitarian elements in Locke, I think. And the elements of genuine moral normativity are there in Locke and possibly Bentham. So you could count them as rationalists. So Locke says all obligation binds conscience and lays a bond on the mind itself, so that not fear of punishment, but a rational apprehension of what is right puts us under an obligation. And Bentham says the greatest happiness principle is a fundamental axiom. Okay, so I'm a little bit concerned about some of the things that he says about some of these 17th to 18th century people. And going back to Hume and Smith, Schweitzer, I think, rightly says that Hume is a utilitarian. And there is a debate about this in Hume scholarship. And I would say 20 years ago, it's probably split about 50-50. So half the scholars thought he was utilitarian and the other half didn't. I think it's changed now. It's become quite unfashionable to be a utilitarian unless you're an effective altruist or something. And people have moved towards, because they don't want, it's a problem in philosophy, I suppose, as in many disciplines, that people want to interpret their heroes in a way that fits their own preconceptions. And so it's now less common to say that Hume is a utilitarian, but I think he is. But so I think Schweitzer is right about that. But actually, I don't think Hume is a utilitarian in the normal sense. He doesn't think the right action is to maximize utility. He's a deontologist when he's within morality. So why is he utilitarian? It's because he thinks morality itself is just a useful enterprise that we've sort of invented. So he's utilitarian there. But once you're in it, utilitarian claims about what's right and what's wrong are a mistake there. So I think Schweitzer's basically right there, but I think I slightly tweak his view. And I think Schweitzer also, well, I mean, I think he sort of misses out a remarkable thing about Hume and Smith, who, I mean, admittedly, it was a bit later when Smith did this. So essentially, I think if you look at the history of Western philosophy, from Socrates onwards, people tended to think that self-interest and morality lined up with one another. That was the view that they wanted to push, either because your well-being, your eudaimonia, your happiness, or whatever, your self-interest is being virtuous, doing the virtuous thing. Or if it's not that, and it's something like, for example, the balance of pleasure over pain in your life, you've got to remember the afterlife. Because it may be that in this world, you can do bad things, and at the end of your life, you're as it were, you're doing well. You know, your life's going better than it would have otherwise. But then you've got the afterlife to contend with, and that will be that'll make it a mistake for you to have acted badly in this life. And I think if you look at the main philosophers in our tradition, Hume is the first person to say, this is rubbish. We all know that morality and self-interest conflict. We need to face up to that. There is no afterlife. Bad people sometimes do better through being bad. And he says this in his discussion of the Knave, though he's also very much aware of the benefits that can come from being virtuous. It's just in rather extreme cases, if you are just a totally vicious individual and you're going to be able to sleep at night, and you're quite comfortable in contemplating your own character, you could win. So that's his Knave. And then Smith's got this example of the soldiers who are marching off to their deaths. They know they're going to die on the battlefield, but they're ready to do it for their country. And he's assuming that they're not thinking about the afterlife there. So one thing which I think Schweitzer might have said is that at that point in British moral philosophy, something remarkable happens because we get the possibility of sacrifice again, which now people take for granted. I mean, I think most people just think it's obvious that you can sometimes morality costs you something. That's what most people think now, but they didn't used to, at least in philosophy. Okay. Right. This also has come up a little bit before. So from Hobbes to Sidgwick. So Sidgwick died, I think, in the last year of the 19th century. That's 1900, if you can count. I think in that period from Hobbes to Sidgwick, hedonism was dominant. So most of them believed that happiness or well-being consists in the balance of pleasure over pain in your life. There were some exceptions. So Cumberland, Mandeville, and Reeve weren't like that. They held a view a bit more like the ancient philosophers who thought it consisted in virtue, but on the whole, they were hedonists. And yeah, so there, I guess I'm inclined, like probably some others here, to think that those people, and whether you think the hedonism is right or wrong, it's better than Schweitzer's view, because all these people made the assumption that happiness comes into being only with consciousness. So there's nothing good about being being one of the bacteria or a plant. And the question you could ask yourself here, which Schweitzer raises, is would you create a world of innumerable bacteria and plants, any number you like? There's got to be one individual in there suffering. Would you do that? That's all they do. They just suffer. Nothing good in their life. I think most people say no, and they'd say no because there's no value in the lives of bacteria and plants. Right. Yeah. Okay. Schweitzer really likes certain of these British philosophers, and one of his favourites is Shaftesbury. So he says, he just writes so beautifully. He says, with Shaftesbury, ethics descend from a rocky mountain range into a luxuriant plain. What does he like about Shaftesbury? Well, he likes the living philosophy of nature, the mysticism, the pantheism, which he thinks is sort of harmless, take it too far. And he calls it an ethics bound up with a philosophy of life that is full of vitality. And that's I'm not sure what word that translates vitality, but it certainly in the English translation comes up quite a lot. This is his emphasis on life. So it's a philosophy of life. He likes that. But I suspect Schweitzer might not have read Shaftesbury's Regimen, which was not as well known as his other works. That's quite different. I mean, with that, it's a very stoic book, and Shaftesbury is yeah, he probably suffered from depression, I would say, quite manic depression, perhaps, where he has complete disgust for his body and material things in general, and wants to identify himself with the mental rather than anything else. Then we go on to the later British moral philosophy. I think Schweitzer gets Spencer just about right. He says he may be making a joke, but it's rather an apt one if he is. He says Spencer was immensely influential in his time, but his star has completely faded now. I think rightly, and he says Spencer is more biologist than moralist. So Spencer actually was a bit like Schweitzer in a way in that he sort of smudged the distinction between his and ought a bit, and got very excited about evolutionary theory, quite rightly, but then thought that you could get an ethics just out of that, which of course you can't. I mean, evolutionary theory is about how things are, not how they should be, and many people still don't realise that. But Schweitzer did. He didn't say much about Mill, surprisingly enough, who I suppose was the greatest British moral philosopher of the 19th century, or the higher pleasures, which is a bit surprising. I mean, given the like Shaftesbury and the sort of aestheticism that you find in Shaftesbury, a bit odd he didn't say anything about the higher pleasures. And he said an apt thing there about Sidgwick. He says Sidgwick tries to combine ethical personality, which is essentially sort of egoistic personality, with utilitarianism without examining their higher unity. I think that's a bit unfair, because Sidgwick ends his famous book, The Methods of Ethics, by spending quite a lot of time trying to prove the existence of God, which would give him higher unity, because his idea is, on the one hand, he thinks you should be a utilitarian, on the other hand, he thinks egoism is reasonable. But in this world, it looks like they conflict, because if you go around maximizing everybody else's happiness, your own happiness will go down. So Sidgwick thinks, well, if there is an afterlife, if there's a God making sure that you're punished, then you'd have reason to obey morality. But he can't find an argument. So he does try. And I guess my view about Sidgwick is a bit different from Schweitzer's. I think what Sidgwick should have said is, if he thought that utilitarianism had a lot going for it, and he thought egoism had a lot going for it, he should have said, there are two principles in ethics, the utilitarian principle and the egoistic principle, and you have to balance them up in each case you come up with. So if you can create a vast amount of utility at a small cost to yourself, then you should. If you can create a small amount of increase in utility at a massive cost to yourself, then maybe you shouldn't. So what he needs is kind of Aristotelian practical wisdom, which he didn't even consider, because I think people in the 19th century were operating on the whole with a kind of Newtonian kind of ethic, where you want a theory, you want a book that will tell you the right answer to every single ethical problem you ever have to face, which is a complete pipe dream, isn't it? I mean, nobody's going to write such a book. Aristotle realised that many years ago. Another philosopher that Schweitzer likes is T.H. Green, and particularly his perfectionism, his idea that what we should be doing is perfecting our nature as human beings. And again, we get that word vitality. Green's thoughts are full of vitality. But nevertheless, Schweitzer has criticism. He says they leave unsolved, however, indeed they do not even put the question how the higher life affirmation comes to give itself a content which stands in contradiction to the course of nature. And all I can think here is that, well, either Schweitzer hadn't read Green's Prolegomena, or he had forgotten it. Because the Prolegomena is trying to do exactly that. And there's a lot more detail in there than there is in than there is in Schweitzer. So I would say actually, if one is interested in Schweitzer's ethics and in developing it, one good thing to do would be to study Green's road economy. And I think that's it.
Mhm. Thank you. Well,